right, how y'all doing? Um, I got to get my presentation in, so here we go. Um, Mine is on post-traumatic stress disorder, which Caleb's already done a presentation on that, and he did an excellent job. So I'm just going to be piggybacking off of what he did. Definition is post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health condition that develops in response to experiencing or witnessing an extremely stressful event, including the threat of death or extreme bodily harm, such as sexual assault, physical violence, military combat. It can occur in the wake of a car crash, fire, earthquake, or other natural disaster, or any sudden disruptive event. It's characterized by vivid, intrusive memories of the precipitating event, hypervigilance and reactivity to possible threats, nightmares, and mood disturbances. Those suffering from PTSD often report feeling anxious or scared even in the absence of danger. The condition may manifest in anxiety like symptoms, emotional numbness, dysphoria, anger, aggression, or any combination of the above. Um, it's as if one's normal stress response is locked in a permanent overdrive. So you can be in a fight or flight mode at all times, even when there's no reason to be. Um, Very disruptive to your daily life. But what is even worse is the complex PTSD. And that really has to do with cumulative interpersonal trauma, like domestic violence, torture, genocide, or child abuse. Um, any of these things, but especially when it's experienced in childhood. Um, and the complex PTSD is just an amped up version. Um, Several studies lend support to a complex CPTSD diagnosis to have shown that cumulative interpersonal childhood trauma can result in complex post-traumatic symptomology. This includes PTSD symptoms as well as disturbances in affect regulation, dissociation, personal perception, which is feelings of worthlessness, or shame, and interpersonal relationships, not feeling close to others. And this is, like I say, early in life, but it's when you have ongoing things. Uh, a child is abused, and then the abuser continues to come back and abuse over and over and over again, and each time it's just, they know what's coming, it's terrible, and the reaction is deeper and longer. I don't have this on the handout, but they're doing studies now in the prison populations of both women and men that are showing that complex post-traumatic stress disorder is widespread in prison populations. So it's seen as a potential causal effect of being in prison, reckless activities, which brings the attention of police. You do them enough, you get arrested for doing stupid stuff, which anytime you hear anything from prisoners, most of it's stupid stuff. But also just reckless activities sexually, being nude in public, prostitution, promiscuous activities, violence against the other sex, mainly by men, and drug abuse, self-medicating to cover the pain caused by this. So there's just an aggravation and violence to others. It's just a good possibility that PTSD is a chronic, deep-rooted problem with the violence and the lawlessness in our society. Treatment options for PTSD are center around talk therapy. But new forms of treatment are being developed that combine talk therapy and medication. and that shows very promising. 50% of sufferers whose symptoms are not relieved by current strategies are helped by using medication in addition to the talk therapy, or in step with. Um, Studies suggest that it may even be possible to prevent PTSD from occurring, especially from high-risk situations, which now you'll notice every time there's a school shooting or any kind of violence like that in churches or whatever. They rush counselors and grief counselors to go in and deal with the emotions that are at hand before the PTSD steps in. That's something that Caleb had covered in his presentation. Psychotherapy, particularly exposure therapy and cognitive reappraisal therapy, has proved to be the most reliable treatments for PTSD. The goal is to restore cognitive flexibility so that the sufferers can talk about their bad experiences and modify the emotional forces of their memory. And the conclusion on the presentation handout is, as a result, as research continues to reveal the broad depths of the effects of PTSD, it's difficult to narrow the treatment spectrum. In cases of a single traumatic event, counseling, cognitive, and therapeutic treatments can be highly effective. But when confronted with the effects of complex PTSD, research has not revealed all of the questions to ask, much less the treatments to answer. And I just wanted to include some of my own personal experiences, unfortunately, with this. And I had no idea that I had a problem with PTSD. But when I entered seminary, I did my first semester online, and I had no idea what my calling was. And it was something I was in prayer about. And I was working in Gallia Hall, and the streets surrounding Gallia Hall they're basically alleyways. And I had walked out of a side door at lunch and spoken with someone. Took about 5 steps, and a truck passed by, a box type truck, and just this horrible noise. I mean, I looked at the truck; it sounded like something had fallen over inside of it, and it passed. And when it did, there was a dead body on the ground, about 30 or 40 feet away. The sound that I had heard, a guy had jumped off of a 15-story hotel, off the roof. And the only thing that stopped me from seeing him hit was the truck passing at the exact moment. And of course, there was a guy that was in his vehicle backing up, and he's looking in his rearview mirror and sees this guy just splat in his rearview mirror directly behind his truck. And it's like in a hotel, a little driveway in the back of a hotel. So he started screaming, banged on the door. A woman came out. She started screaming. Everybody was going nuts. And it was very surreal. I mean, this guy his head didn't blow up or anything. He was laying in an unnatural position. But besides that, it looked like he could have just fallen off of a ladder or something. But he was obviously dead. And I went over and prayed for him. And looking back now, obviously it affected me extremely bad, because I went and had lunch, and when I went back, the police were there by this point. Ambulances were there, but it really didn't affect me. I went inside, I got my lunch, went inside and ate, and no big deal. Guys that I was working with were talking about it, and I was like, yeah, I was there when it happened. And starting that night, I started having problems sleeping and anxiety, and within a couple of days, I was just wound up inside, couldn't sleep, and I had done a lot of counseling through the course of my life with kids and mates. I've been around for a long time, so when you go through enough relationships and you live enough life, I learned that counseling was the way to deal with it. Um, so I called right away. I had actually just gotten out of counseling when I started my walk again with Christ. It was recommended. I just said I don't want to fail again. I tried again and again to get my walk straight and could never quite do it for a long period of time. And I didn't want to screw this up. And it was suggested that I do counseling and I do mentoring, and I did everything that I was told. And I had just gotten out of counseling maybe 3 or 4 months prior, um, after about 3 years. Um, and this was more like actual Christian counseling. Um, so I got right back in, and we did cognitive. We talked about it. Then we did cognitive, where I was in the room, but went through the event because I was having trouble. I would hear, but I could not picture him. I couldn't see him, and I had gotten within a couple of feet of him. But I just could not. My mind just would not release that image of him, but I could hear the sound, and that was like so disturbing to hear the sound. But then I couldn't see him. And what I found in the therapy, and of course she was a student. The therapist was a student at level, or whatever, at a New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary in a master's program. So she had to do research to even figure out how to deal with this, and she did a really good job though, and basically did a an eye pattern, the REM eye pattern, waving her hand in rhythm. That didn't work for me as well as just getting a tap on the leg with the rhythm. And I would go through the event step by step. And we did this a couple of times. And the second time we did it, I went home and I was so sleepy. I went to sleep and slept for like 6 hours. And when I woke up, I could remember everything perfectly normal. But what it made me realize, all these memories from my childhood kept coming up. I had seen a little girl when I was about 4 years old. It was like a 3-year-old girl was crossing Franklin Avenue right between Interstate and Seminary. Was crossing Franklin Avenue, and a vehicle sped around us. My sister was driving, my mother was in the front seat, flew past us, and this little girl, I was standing up in the back seat. You used to be able to do that. This little girl pulled away from her mother, I thought at the time, but it was like a block in front of us. But I wasn't focused on the vehicle passing us. I was focused on these 2 kids and this woman crossing the street. And the little girl pulled away from what was a nanny and ran across the street. And this vehicle that sped past us hit her. And we were a few car lengths behind her. And she flew in the air and landed in front of our car and projectile vomited blood. And that had stuck with me, and I hadn't thought of it in years. But when I overcame the first trauma that came up, there had been an old movie theater in my neighborhood, which they used to have those kind of things too, and it had burned big time, and took out like 23 or 30 houses. I went back, actually, when I started thinking of this again, I went back and looked it up in the newspapers, archives, and this was all there. 30 houses were burned, so it was a really big deal. But that had affected me. There had been a murder I grew up by the Fairgrounds racetrack, and there was a bar across the street, and this guy had been shot in the temple and has brains blown out. And my brother came home and told my parents, and it was like, well, let's walk over and see what's going on. I had no idea this guy was still laying uncovered on the sidewalk. So there was just quite a few different events that had happened in my childhood. I would have said I had this calm, peaceful childhood, nothing to it. But in actuality, I'd had all these things happen. And was able to work through that therapy, that with the REM movement, which actually, where it was explained to me, is when you go to sleep at night, when you have an event like that, your brain sorts and puts all the memories into the separate places. You don't just have a memory of everything. You have a visual memory, a sound memory, a smell memory, and they all go into separate parts of your brain, and they're all accessed. When you think about it, they're all accessed. So when you see something that's really beautiful, it may strike you how pretty it is, and that part of it's really vivid. Or sometimes it's a great smell, and when you think about walking into a room or into a kitchen, it's unbelievable, and you can actually almost smell it. Well, when there's a traumatic event, those things don't go into memory properly, and that's why I couldn't visualize this guy, because the sight memory went into the wrong place, so it wasn't being recalled. But it was very revealing how much therapy could do for you. And it was probably 3 or 4 weeks. I went through all these events and cleared them all out, and huge difference. I mean, just a tremendous difference in my level of calmness and ability to sleep. And I realized what my calling was. I had taken every psychology class that was ever available from junior high on junior college, and was always interested in it, and for a good reason. And through this event, which could have been way worse than it was, I could have actually seen him hit the ground. His head could have exploded. When he did hit the ground, it could have been a really grisly sight. So it could have been much worse than it was. He was going to die anyway. He committed suicide, and I just think God used what happened for my personal good. So that's my experience with it. So PTSD is something that is close to me, obviously, but therapy does work, and it did work for me. Thanks for listening to me blabber on. Have a good day, guys. Enjoy the rest of the semester, and enjoy when it's over with, especially. I know I will. Have a good day. Bye.